Today, I'm speaking with Josh Kramer. He is the author of the new book, The Unicorn in You. And he's talking a lot about his new concept of unself-help. So rather a way of being and rather than doing. And we're going to be talking about how awareness is a huge part of how we can navigate through life and things like a pandemic in a much more empowered way. So enjoy. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast for this week. This week, we actually have a gentleman as a guest. We don't normally have a lot of men on the podcast, but my guest today is Josh Kramer, and Josh has just released a book called The Unicorn in You. So, ladies, we all know about being a unicorn. We all know about, stepping into this brilliant part of our lives. And what I love about Josh and his work is that when it comes to self-help, he has more of an unself-help approach. So we definitely want to be unpacking that today. So how are you, Josh?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Natalie.
Yeah.
And I have to say that it's probably appropriate to kick off my promotional tour because I'm talking about the unicorn in you, and I'm told that you are a unicorn.
Yes.
So I'm thrilled to be with you.
On a few different levels. I'm actually
That's
part
right.
of a group called the Unicorns, but then my partner, my boyfriend, calls me a unicorn as well. So,
I love it.
Yeah. And I love, kind of owning that moniker because it means that, I'm really stepping into the best version of who I am and, shining from that place. So...
That's right. And it's interesting, too, because one of the things I talk about symbolically, why I use the unicorn, I tell a story actually of my 4-year-old niece in these little unicorn sneakers she had, where she embodied this peace and joy very unself-consciously. And I was thinking of how I could embody that as well. But the idea of the unicorn, exactly as you're saying, is our greater potential. It's very ambitious. And so I love symbolically what it represents.
Yeah, me too. So unself-help, what does that mean? What does that look like?
So by way of background, I've been reading self-help books probably for the better part of 25 years. I have had my own struggles with mental health challenges and sadness and depression along the way. And it was around the time of the onset of COVID where I said I was looking for an approach that I could relieve some of my anxiety and worry. And what I found was that so many of my studies weren't very instinctive. I was trying to think back to these processes and mechanisms, and it didn't feel very natural. And that's when I said, how can I have something, maybe a perspective, that is not so much a process, but allows us to kind of look a little bit deeper at our foundation for being rather than doing. Right. And so that's when I came up with my foundation of these 5 principles. And the second part to that, the idea of the unself-help approach, is that it's taking the emphasis off of self. And I believe that by doing so, we're able to get on a path to peace and joy a little bit easier.
Right. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, I agree with you on the whole being part of self-development. I think that for us to be able to step into a better version of who we are or become a better version of who we are, we have to have a lot of self-awareness. And so, and we have to look at, and I don't know whether the processes, like we touched a little earlier on gratitude. Now, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, in the beginning, incorporating or implementing gratitude can be a bit of a process, but then it becomes a part of our being. Would that be right?
Absolutely. And to your point, you used in a word there, this idea that I believe at least that gratitude is driven mostly by awareness.
Right.
And so much of our sense of being grateful has to do with our sense of being aware. I believe it has to do with being more present in the moment. I also believe that it has to do with understanding or at least recognizing that we can look at things as happening for us, not to us.
Right.
And so those are ways of us being certainly more grateful and just being, I think, more recognizing around us all the good that's around us, in many ways shining a light on the positive in our lives.
Right. Absolutely. And so you talked about 5 pillars or 5 things. Can you share what they are with us?
Right. So what I believe, or at least the path that I present for peace and joy in the unicorn in you, are these 5 principles. And it's kindness, it's gratitude, integrity, humility, and acceptance. And through each, I have really one key ingredient that I think drives them. For kindness, I believe that it has to do with compassion. For gratitude, it's awareness. Integrity, I believe you have to have decency. Humility is about perspective, and acceptance is about flexibility. But I think that the key common thread between all of these is selflessness. And again, going back to that theme of the unself-help approach, I believe that you could have these 5 foundational principles that allows you to take the emphasis off of self. In many ways, take the anxiety and worry and burdens that we carry. And I think more than anything else with this book, I am trying to prompt people to understand and maybe discover what foundations work in their lives. Obviously, it has to be something that's personal to them, but what is it that's a part of your being that lets you find peace and joy? And so this, in many ways, if anything, it starts the conversation.
Right. All right. So let's go straight to the juicy one. Let's talk about acceptance.
Sure.
And flexibility. Because, I think that the way that I would describe this is surrender. But I think it could be a similar thing. So what does acceptance look like?
It's so interesting because I've been speaking to a lot of people, and the fact that you identified it as the juicy one, I think is spot on.
Yeah.
It's easy to latch on to the kindness. That's a nice one to get started with. And gratitude, integrity, we know what that is. And humility, I think, is quite underappreciated. Acceptance was something that I felt is the anchor to this foundation. And I agree with you completely. It's about surrender. In many ways, it is acknowledging truth. It is understanding what is rather than regretting what isn't. And the reason why I think flexibility is so important as this principle is that it's okay in our lives to have conflicting feelings, emotions, thoughts in our head. In many ways, it gives us flex, it gives us stretch. And I think it's a sign, or at least that I've come to believe, of strong mental health when we're able to hold competing views, competing feelings in our head, accepting that this is just the reality. We have so many thoughts that go in and out of our head, but having that flexibility. At a point in time when I wrote this, I thought that there was an idea of tolerance being an important principle. But tolerance, I thought, had to do more with putting up with. And so to your point, this idea of surrendering to it, is at least acknowledging and letting it be and understanding that it is a reality. So acceptance, I think, is so important in our personal lives and our professional lives. It allows us to let go in many ways.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, tolerance is more of a, you know what, I'm just going to put up with whatever you're saying right now, but I'm not agreeing and I'm not meeting you or having any kind of empathy from where you're coming from.
Right.
So yeah, I agree with that. So, and for me, and I describe this as surrender. And as you said before, surrendering into knowing that things are happening for me, not to me. So when it comes to embodying or being acceptance, how do you do that?
I think for me, and what I teach in the book is the first thing, I call it feel it first. I think that oftentimes we deny our true feelings about something. Perhaps a relationship ends, right? And we may rationalize or refuse to acknowledge how we really feel about it. And I think that feeling it first is actually quite key. It allows you to get down to maybe some of the hard emotions that are associated with what's ever happened that we need to learn to accept. So I think feeling it first is very, very important. I also think that eliminating ego, almost separating ourselves from it, looking at it a little bit from a different point of view, almost from above, I think is also essential because it gives us a little bit more objectivity, perhaps. And lastly, if there were a 3-step part to this, I think that you have to make peace with it. And in many ways, find the positive in order to make peace with it. In many ways, going back to what you said, we find things that, they happen for us, not to us. Perhaps a relationship ends and we're disappointed in it, but we're able to find something that we're grateful for that it gave us. Right. It came into our life for a reason and now it's over and that's okay. And acceptance is a very powerful thing because it almost allows you to move forward in life. And if it means that you have to still carry feelings that are of hurt and sadness, that's okay. Because you're at least acknowledging the truth.
Yeah. And how I describe, especially that, being outside of the situation is becoming the observer.
Yes.
If you've read Michael Singer's The Untethered Soul, You
That's
know,
great.
the opening of that, the first, few pages is like, who am I really?
Right.
Am I my thoughts, or am I that which observes my thoughts or is aware of my thoughts? And I think for us to be able to look at a situation that, is not, we don't feel positive about in the beginning, let's say, because, again, if everything's happening for our highest good. And the other thing too, let's just say that sometimes looking for the positive may take a bit of time for that to unfold. It's not like something terrible happens and we go, right, I have to drop into doing a spiritual bypass and going, okay, let's look for the positive so I can bypass off my emotions. But, having that, being able to emotionally detach and then step outside of it and go, okay, what are the things at play? But for us to be able to get there, I think we need to feel the emotions first. We have to let them run through. Yeah.
That's so well said. And the idea of being the observer, I'm curious how you and eventually teach it to those that follow you and your students, because that detachment is not easy to do.
No.
At least allowing yourself or somehow, when you try to remove yourself from a situation that you are so close to, you're almost too close to. I think back to, we have all had friends that could tell us, things that are going wrong with, perhaps, again, back to this relationship. And we see it so clearly, right? We know what they should be doing. It's obvious to us, but they're in it. And similar in our lives, we're in it. And so to have that ability to detach, it's very powerful. And then you can certainly become the observer. But to your point, I think that feeling at first, at least, is coming to terms with our true emotions about something. And that's a meaningful step towards acceptance.
Yeah. And I think it also, being the observer, allows us to look at our role in whatever's been happening as well. It's our actions, our emotions, how we show up can really influence a lot of the events that happen in our life. It doesn't affect, not all of them, because there's a lot of things that happen, like a pandemic, which is out of our control. But there are other things we go, okay, well, if this same situation is coming up on a regular basis, and I'm the common denominator, maybe it could be me.
That's right. What do I have to do with this? And it's funny, because I do speak about this in the book, exactly what you're saying. What's my role in this? And in many ways, it has to do with us taking responsibility and understanding that, okay, even if we're wronged, what part do we play in it? And I think that it's, in many ways, it's just a sign of maturity. This is all of these things that we're talking about. They're not destinations, right? This is a process. This is a longer path. But understanding that, or at least recognizing there is a role that we play in everything, even if it's a very small one. And then we can learn from that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And getting to that point where we can do that, it can take time. And I think the other thing is that we don't want to do is be, beaten up on ourselves mentally, going, oh, I should have known better. Why did I do this? I feel like a fool, or whatever that is, because that doesn't help the situation.
Not at all. And you're talking, obviously, about how sometimes we are our own worst critic. We're very hard on ourselves, and we don't forgive ourselves. And so much of, going back to when I mentioned the first principle of kindness, this idea of compassion, but so much of it is self-compassion. And being a little bit easier on ourselves, being a little bit of an easier judge and critic. Yeah,
absolutely. And so when it comes to this acceptance, is there something that we do? I mean, we can go, okay, I'm choosing to be more accepting and reminding myself that, things are happening for our highest good. But is there something that I can do that can facilitate that as a way of being for me?
I think in and of itself, the idea of accepting something allows us to, in many ways, simply be. The emphasis and thrust of the book is, and I call it A Path to Peace and Joy. I really believe that there are so many wonderful approaches out there, and I never want to suggest that there's a one-size-fits-all, especially in this world of personal growth and development. We're all at different times and places of our journeys. But I think that so much of peace and joy is rooted in our sense of being, exactly as you're saying. And, how acceptance plays into that, for me, at least, I find that when I still may be able to hold something in my mind, in my heart, that is painful, but coming to terms with it can be its own power. And I really do think that in many ways, in my life at least, I've been able to find more peace and joy by, if nothing else, acknowledging the truth in my life, acknowledging the reality. And that has given me sort of that sense of being. I don't have to do anything about it. I just have to at least acknowledge the truth.
Yeah. And so acknowledging that, how does that change how you show up in the world?
I think when we are rooted in reality, and certainly it's not for its own sake, I think that we show up with a sense of even greater confidence. We have let go of these rationalizations. I think for me, what I always struggled with in my wellness was ruminations. Right. I think rationalizations are equally dangerous, and how we can convince ourselves of other things. But there is a sense of self-power when we show up with acceptance of something. In many ways, I see people that have overcome, and I admire so much, they've overcome difficult things in their lives, and they still may not like it, but they're showing up with a sense of at least a maturity, a power, almost as if they're owning it. Mm. And I think that can give someone, it's a real source of strength.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And I think too, like with the pandemic, for example, because that event seemed to be, the motivation or the insight for you to write the book and to do this work. Collectively, the world is going through a situation together. We've all been affected by this pandemic, but our experience of it has been different. And I think part of that is, yes, absolutely, when it comes to, where you are on the poverty scale and, what happened with jobs and all that kind of things. But even with those extrinsic events happening, how we show up and how we move through this and how we choose to see things. So we don't have control of the big events like this. But what we do have control over is how we choose to see it, how we choose to respond to it, and how long we allow it to affect us moving forward.
You're absolutely right. And I'm sure you came across so many people over the last 2 years. It's amazing to think we're talking about 2 years now, just a little shy of that, depending on where you are in the world. And I've seen people, and certainly, and I acknowledge this in the beginning of The Unicorn in You, saying, I knew people were struggling personally and professionally. I felt there was going to be a responsibility here to look a little deeper. I felt that there were going to be going to be gifts from this time. I just didn't know how to uncover them. But as I reflect now, and I'm wondering if you had the same experience, there were so many people I came across that really struggled, obviously, because perhaps they were worried about. There were people that was almost as if this was their moment. Staying inside gave them comfort. This was the time they were waiting for, where they didn't have to be so social. And I don't want to say COVID was a non-event for them, but they thrived. And other people really struggled. And I don't know if you found you came across with folks who really would say things like, I'm over it, as if we had a choice to be over it. We didn't, of course. And certainly I knew too many people that didn't survive and, of course, have struggled. And you're right, it all depends on where you are in your life and what you're doing personally, professionally. It was a completely different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, like one of the gifts I got from 2020 was being able to work with my coach every week because I wasn't traveling all the time. And there was a couple of things that come out of that, because I remember initially in the beginning, I'm starting to get a little stir crazy. And I mean, I live in an apartment, but it's lovely and I've got nice views. It's not like I'm penned in or anything like that. And I was by myself just with my dog, but I remember watching a documentary on Netflix about, the mass incarceration of, black men in America. And they showed this scene in one of the jails where it was just like this huge big room with all of these bunk beds. Like it could have been easily 100 beds. And all these men were just in this one room. And I looked at that and went, oh, I need to stop complaining about my situation here. Like, are you kidding me? Perspective. This is crazy. Right. But the other thing too, and I think this is part of the awareness piece as well, is that, I think we all have stories that we tell about past events. And especially if they're events that have really affected us or that we emotionally are still attached to, you know, terrible stories from our childhood, or, you know, the relationship that went wrong, or, you know, whatever those past things are. And I remember one of the gifts I got from that was, you know, Nat, when you tell these stories, it's time to start telling them from the place of evolution where you are now. And it gave me an opportunity to look back and go, oh, when I tell that story, I'm still telling it like I'm the victim.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. That's powerful. And you're talking obviously about the narrative.
Yeah.
And when changing that narrative. But it's from the point of reference of certainly that time of reference. And I think that, you know, if there's one thing I'm going to take from this conversation, it's that very idea, because that's powerful to say, this is something that hurt me back then, and I'm still telling the story from that perspective of who I was at whatever age, versus now, what I've gained from it, who I am now. You see it very differently. And unfortunately, sometimes we stay in that same place, the way we're telling it to others, as well as, most importantly, to ourselves.
Yeah.
No question.
And I'm telling it from the point of pain that I felt back then, or whatever emotions I was feeling.
That's right.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's interesting because we could be moving forward. Like, you know, you could read, if you're listening to the podcast, you could read this book and you get this understanding. And moving forward, you know, we're looking at the positive in things that are happening and, you know, and all of that. But yet we're still telling those stories from that place. It's like,
that's right.
You know, so that was a big lesson, a huge lesson for me. And part of that awareness, because it's like, no, it was a gift. And as soon as I can not just look at these current events that are happening, but past events and going, well, what were the gift in those things? That actually helps to really shift my energy and shift, you know, who I am and how I'm being in the world.
Absolutely. And you say that obviously this is now March of 2020. We're coming up on that. Do those 2 years, does it feel like it flew by there for you? Or does it feel like that was yesterday? There's a difference between 20 and 21, but here we are. Does a year ago feel like 5 minutes ago and 2 years ago feel like 10 years ago? How did you kind of reconcile those things? 2020
was the longest and shortest year of my life.
Right.
Simultaneously. It was weird because, and even now when, you know, I don't know if you find this, but, you know, we'll be thinking back to something that happened. I'll be talking to friends and wait, oh my God, that was 3 years ago, because these last 2 years seem like this little blip that happened.
Yes.
Know? It was, and it is surreal when you think about it.
Yeah. And it was a before COVID, after COVID kind of time reference.
Right. Yeah.
No question.
Yeah. And I actually met my partner during COVID.
You know? Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. And again, that was another gift that came from that. It was because I had nothing on my calendar.
Right.
Funny how you got a lot of time and all of a sudden you have time for a relationship. And again, I was looking at that as the positive. It's like, okay, how do we do this? And, you know, there are like, this is a prime example of looking at this. Some people go, oh my God, the only way to meet people is online. You know, that's too scary. I don't want to do that. You know, and of course I'm going, yeah, the only way to meet people is online. Fantastic. Everyone's online.
Everyone's online.
Same words, but completely different, you know, meanings that we put to that. Yeah.
No question. I picked up also, you had mentioned something that you were in your apartment when things started, of course, and you had your dog. Mm-hmm. And I have a dog as well. And it's going to sound a little crazy, but my relationship with my dog has gotten so strong, so deep, and so powerful. And as a first-time dog owner and new lover, it's been this amazing sense of comfort and relationship that I think was perhaps even perpetuated by this time, COVID, and being together. And I think a lot of people can relate to this time. And a lot of people got pets during COVID.
Absolutely.
I know that there was, and that was a source of comfort as well. So I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to also mention about acceptance is that when you are embodying acceptance as a part of who you are and how you navigate the world, it means that you know, for me, it's like, okay, rules have changed, COVID's hit, you know, we just have to figure out what the new rules of engagement are and keep moving forward. You know, that's kind of life for me, but it was like really exaggerated and accelerated during the pandemic, because it's like, okay, the rules really have changed. You know,
right.
My business is online, you know, people's behavior online changed. You're like,
Very
okay,
much so.
let's figure this out and keep going. And that is part of that acceptance, just knowing that change is always coming. It's the only constant.
You're right. And something you said in there, I think, is so key and probably transcends all of these principles and any of our great life principles, and the idea of moving forward. That's really what life is. And certainly acceptance is what allows you to move forward, for sure. But in any instance, we're either, and I hate to sound so morbid about it, we're either growing or we're dying, right? If you kind of stay in the same place, you're more dying than anything else. But moving forward, acceptance is what allows you to do that as well. And this evolution in our lives, where is our improvement coming from? Where is our personal growth coming from? Where's our perspective and sense of awareness coming from? And that all has to do with this idea that I need to move forward in life.
Yeah.
And it's a great lesson for everyone.
Yeah. Well, it's an awesome time to get your hands on this book, The Unicorn in You, by Josh Kramer, because I honestly feel like, if you look back at the 1918s, like when the Spanish flu was around, that really, again, took out a lot of the population, what preceded that, or what followed that, was the Roaring Twenties. And I feel like we are now in our time of the Roaring Twenties. And now it is a time of rebirth. It's a time of, acceleration. It's a time of, fun. It's a time of, okay, we all got through that. Like humanity, we did it. We got through it. Now, the gift of being able to survive something like that, how do we thrive afterwards? And I think that the principles that you share in the book are perfect for this time.
Oh, I so appreciate that. And you're right. That whole idea of the Roaring Twenties, I love that analogy, because in many ways it's validated with what people are doing with their lives now, what they're wanting to do with their personal lives, their professional lives, especially we've seen in the workforce. But really, it's a recognition of what we do with our time. And our time is our great commodity. It's been the lesson that we've taken from the last 2 years. Certainly our health is our wealth. But time is that commodity that I think we're all much more in tune with and acutely aware of. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I hope that, people will consider checking out The Unicorn in You. It's meant to be a warm kind of nightstand sort of guide to help, people find a path to peace and joy.
Wonderful. So Josh, if people want to reach out to you and get their hands on the book, how can they do that?
Absolutely. You check out the book online wherever books are sold, but theunicorninyou.com, as well as my personal site, Come Say Hey, at heyjoshkramer.com. And I really enjoy connecting with people, hearing different thoughts, sharing some ideas, and getting feedback. And I appreciate everyone taking a look at the book and seeing and listening what they think about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'm so happy and grateful that, the pandemic for you was a time to come to these realizations, but then also the opportunity to share your message with the world. So
very much so. And I appreciate, thank you. I appreciate having me, Natalie.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Cheers.